When Mark and Emily first moved into the quiet suburban community of Willow Creek Estates, they thought they had finally found their dream neighborhood. The houses were neat, the streets lined with tall oak trees, and neighbors waved politely. When passing by, it seemed like the perfect place to raise their young daughter and enjoy the stability they had worked so hard for. What they hadn't expected, however, was the shadow of the homeowners association looming over every little decision they made. The center of that shadow stood Karen, the HOA president, a woman who seemed to thrive on control and the smallest displays of authority. With her clipboard in hand and her habit of patrolling the sidewalks as if she were a sergeant in charge of a military base, Karen quickly became a thorn in their side. At first, the interactions were small, irritations, polite but firm reminders, slipped into their mailbox about minor infractions. One note told them to repaint their fence because the shade of white they chose was not community approved. Another informed them that their garbage bins were left out too long after collection day, even though Mark had brought them in the moment he returned from work. These weren't serious matters, but the steady stream of notices began to wear thin on Emily. She had grown up in neighborhoods where community meant lending a hand, sharing food, or watching over each other's kids, not measuring the length of grass, blades, or the symmetry of holiday decorations. Things escalated during the holiday season. Emily loved decorating for Christmas. Nothing extravagant, just strings of warm lights, a wreath on the door, and a few glowing reindeer on the lawn to delight her daughter. It brought joy to their home, and judging by the smiles of most of the neighbors, to the street as well. But the moment January rolled around, Karen began sending her passive-aggressive messages. According to her interpretation of the HOA bylaws, all holiday decorations had to be removed within 1 week after the new year. Emily, who was juggling a demanding caseload at work and caring for her family, didn't rush to dismantle everything. The lights were still up 2 weeks later, though she had unplugged them. That's when Karen decided to pounce. She first left a notice on their door citing known compliance with seasonal deco guidelines. When Emily didn't respond immediately, Karen sent an official letter from the HOA board demanding compliance or fines would begin accruing. The tone of the letter was unnecessarily harsh, full of legal jargon, almost as if Karen were personally offended by the string of lights still hanging on the eaves of their roof. Emily shook her head at the absurdity. They weren't harming anyone. The lights weren't even turned on. Yet Karen seemed to treat it like a crime against the entire neighborhood by the 3rd week of January. Certified letter arrived, stamped, an official declaring that the family owed $3,500 in fines. The justification was that every day of non-compliance added to the total. Emily was stunned. Mark nearly laughed when he read it, thinking it had to be some kind of joke. But Karen wasn't joking. She was deadly serious. The fine was written as though it were a decree from a court rather than a homeowners club rule. To Karen, this was about principle. It's about showing that her word carried weight and that no one was above the authority of the HOA. Emily, however, was not the kind of person to be bullied. She had spent years in law school, clawed her way up the professional ladder, and had built a reputation for fairness and integrity. She knew exactly where HOA authority began and ended. What Karen was doing wasn't just unfair, was a gross overreach. Emily decided she would not pay. She wasn't about to give in to intimidation tactics that had no real legal teeth. Word spread quickly through Willow Creek Estates. Neighbors whispered about the feud in hushed tones, some taking silent pleasure in seeing Karen's authority challenged, others anxiously wondering what would happen next. Everyone knew Karen enjoyed her position of power a little too much, but most people chose compliance over confrontation to avoid her wrath. Emily's refusal to pay the fine was unprecedented, and it made Karen furious. Karen started escalating her tactics. She began walking by their house more often, making a show of jotting notes onto her clipboard. She sent more letters, each one thicker and more threatening than the last, filled with bold statements about consequences and further action. She even tried to rally other board members to her side, but many of them were tired of her antics and quietly distanced themselves from her crusade. The more isolated Karen felt, the more determined she became to make an example out of Emily and Mark. The breaking point came one chilly February morning when Karen decided that if Emily wouldn't bend to her authority, then she would force. The issue with outside help, marching down the street with her phone in hand, she called the police. Her voice carried loudly enough that a few neighbors heard her insist there was a serious matter of non-compliance that required law enforcement intervention. She described the situation as if she were reporting vandalism or trespassing. Twisting the narrative to make it seem like a pressing community safety issue, Mark and Emily were at home when the knock came at the door. Karen stood off to the side. With her arms crossed, her face smug, convinced she had finally cornered them. Emily looked at her husband, both of them incredulous. Karen had actually called the cops over Christmas lights. It was the kind of petty absurdity they might have joked about with friends. Yet here it was happening in real life. The sound of the officer's boots on the porch echoed with authority. Emily straightened, prepared to explain calmly and logically, while Mark muttered under his breath about how ridiculous the entire situation had become. To them, this was no longer just about a fine. It was about standing up to someone who abused power for her own ego. They had expected the conflict to play out in letters and meetings, maybe even in a civil dispute if Karen pushed far enough. What they didn't expect was for it to escalate into a scene where law enforcement was dragged into a battle over holiday lights and inflated fines. As Emily opened the door to greet the officer, Karen's smirk widened. She clearly thought victory was at hand. But what happened next would not only shatter her smug confidence, it would flip the entire situation on its head. The police officer standing on the porch was a tall man with a commanding presence. His uniform was immaculate, the badge gleaming under the weak February sunlight. He had the kind of calm expression that only came from years of dealing with neighborhood disputes and more serious calls alike. Emily immediately noticed the way he glanced between her and Karen, his brow furrowing slightly as if he already suspected that this incident might not be worth his time. Still, professionalism dictated that he hear both sides. "Ma'am, sir," the officer said politely, addressing Emily and Mark, "I received a call about a community violation. Could we step outside to discuss?" His tone was neutral, though Mark could hear the faintest trace of skepticism in it. Karen, however, jumped in before anyone could respond. "Officer, thank you for coming. These people have refused to comply with the Homeowners Association rules for over a month now. They've racked up fines and ignored every warning. They're disturbing the order of this neighborhood." She spoke with such exaggerated conviction that one might have thought Emily had spray-painted graffiti across the community center. Mark opened his mouth, ready to retort, but Emily gently put a hand on his arm, signaling him to let her handle it. She knew exactly how to navigate situations like this with patience, composure, and just the right amount of authority. She stepped forward, meeting the officer's eyes directly. "Officer," she began in a calm, steady voice, "this is not a criminal matter. This is a civil disagreement between us and the HOA president here. My family has not broken any laws. The only issue is that Karen believes we should pay thousands of dollars for leaving holiday lights on our home a little longer than she deems acceptable." The officer blinked, then slowly turned his head toward Karen. "Holiday lights?" he repeated, as though confirming he'd heard correctly. Karen bristled. "Yes, it's against the HOA rules to keep decorations up beyond the first week of January, and they've been up well past that. Every day adds fines, and we're at over $3,000 now. They've ignored letters, notices, and official warnings. This is willful defiance." There was a pause, a long one. The officer shifted his weight, clearly wrestling with the absurdity of what he was hearing. He opened his mouth, ready to respond, when suddenly recognition flashed across his face. His eyes widened slightly as he looked back at Emily, as though seeing her in a new light. "Wait," he said slowly, squinting at her. "Judge, you live here." The air seemed to freeze. Karen's confident posture faltered. She glanced between the officer and Emily, confusion flooding her features. "Judge," she echoed, her voice suddenly less certain. Emily nodded, her expression serene. "Yes, officer. I serve as a judge in the county courthouse." "I assume we've crossed paths before?" The officer straightened immediately, his demeanor shifting from casual professionalism to deep respect.
Yes, Your Honor,"
he said quickly. I've been in your courtroom several times. You handled the Reynolds case last year. Rye was the arresting officer. I didn't realize this was your residence. Mark couldn't help but suppress a grin as Karen's face drained of color.
Nice.
All the arrogance, all the smug superiority she had displayed just moments earlier evaporated in an instant.
Ow.
The officer turned to her, his tone firm now. No trace of indulgence left. Ma'am, he said to Karen, this is not a police matter. HOA disputes are civil issues, not criminal. One's law enforcement doesn't get involved in enforcing HOA fines. That's between you and your board, and if necessary, the civil courts. Calling us out here for Christmas lights and fines is a misuse of emergency services. Karen opened and closed her mouth like a fish out of water. But they're ignoring the rules. There the officer raised a hand, silencing her. The law doesn't care about HOA holiday deadlines. There's no criminal violation here, given who you're dealing with. He gestured respectfully toward Emily. I'd suggest you consider your approach very carefully going forward. The silence that followed was deafening. A few neighbors who had been watching the scene unfold from a safe distance exchanged knowing glances. Word would spread quickly Karen had overstepped in a very public, very humiliating way. Emily inclined her head graciously toward the officer. Thank you for clarifying that, she said. We'll handle any further disputes with the HOA through the proper civil channels. As is appropriate. Yes, Your Honor, the officer replied. Then, turning back to Karen, he added pointedly, and ma'am, I'd advise against wasting police resources on calls like this again. We have real emergencies to respond to. With that, he gave Emily a respectful nod, saluted lightly, and headed back to his cruiser. The sound of his car engine starting and pulling away left Karen standing frozen on the sidewalk. Her clipboard clutched tightly in her hands. Her face was a mixture of disbelief, humiliation, and barely contained rage. Mark finally spoke, unable to resist. Karen, I guess that settles it. Maybe next time you'll think twice before calling the cops over light bulbs. His tone. It was light, almost amused, but the edge in his words was undeniable. Emily didn't gloat. She simply turned to Karen with the same calm authority she had displayed throughout the encounter. We all want a peaceful neighborhood, Karen, but peace isn't built on intimidation or abuse of power. If you continue down this path, you'll find it leads nowhere productive. I suggest you reconsider how you're running the HOA, Karen sputtered, searching for a comeback, but none came. She turned sharply on her heel and stormed off down the street, her shoulders stiff with indignation. The once confident queen of the neighborhood had been dethroned in a single afternoon, and everyone who witnessed it knew it in the days that followed. Things in Willow Creek Estates changed noticeably. Karen still held the title of HOA president, but her authority had been stripped of its sting. She no longer prowled the sidewalks with her clipboard. Letters became less frequent, less aggressive, and in some cases, stopped altogether. Neighbors, who had long resented her heavy-handedness, now felt emboldened, whispering with relief that someone had finally stood up to her hand one. For Mark and Emily, life settled back into a comfortable rhythm. The holiday lights eventually came down, not out of fear of fines, but simply because spring was arriving. Their home was once again a place of warmth and joy, untouched by Karen's threats. Emily, for her part, didn't mention the incident at work, nor did she use her position to boast. She had always believed that true authority wasn't about flexing power, but about using it wisely and fairly. But the neighborhood never forgot. The story of the HOA president who tried to fine the judge over Christmas lights and called the cops to enforce it became something of a legend in Willow Creek Estates. For years afterward, new residents would hear whispers about the day Karen's reign of intimidation came crashing down on her own front lawn. And every December, when Emily's lights went up again, neighbors smiled a little wider, knowing they were more than just decorations. They were a quiet symbol of standing firm against unfairness. A reminder that even in the smallest battles, integrity could shine the brightest.